You're listening to Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 2nd of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Joe Biden tells protesters he won't change tack on the US position on Israel despite widespread student protests. It's local election day here in the UK, and for those bothering to vote, there's the added bind of having to take your photo ID. And as Japan struggles to chop down the trees that cause hay fever, we ask, what do you want your government to ban to make your life easier? I'm Emma Nelson. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and a warm welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and my guests, Nina dos Santos and James Rodgers, will be here to go through the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Seattle, all about a fight over the Pacific state clam. So stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. And before we get into the main meat and drink of the programme, let me just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I've never seen two better prepared presenters' friends in all my life. I mean, the homework that has been done, the pieces of paper, the pens, the pads. There's even a proper ink pen on your part, James Rodgers. Congratulations.
Thank you. But I've forgotten my glasses.
Oh, Nina's forgotten her glasses. This is going to be fun. Before we start getting into all that and I introduce you to our panel, let's go straight away by looking at the speech given by the US President Joe Biden earlier today, in which he defended the right to protest but insisted that order must prevail because college campuses across the US are facing unrest over the war in Gaza. Dissent is essential for democracy, he said at the White House, but dissent must never lead to disorder. Well, joining us now is Monocle senior news editor Chris Chermack. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Emma.
So this is... We can question the amount of effect that Joe Biden's going to have by making these comments, but we're now at the stage where we have a presidential intervention over what's happening.
We do, and that in itself is certainly significant. It was a short and sweet statement, if you like, but short but firm, I should say, about 3 minutes or so. And as you say, he really tried to draw this quite firm line saying he understands the need to protest, but that doesn't mean that violent protest is okay. And he said that in about as many different ways that he possibly could. You were putting to the test right now two fundamental American principles. The first is the right to free speech and peaceful assembly, making people's voices heard. The second is the rule of law. Both must be upheld. And that really was what he said throughout the speech. One other point that I thought was interesting, perhaps, was that he also emphasized people have the right to an education. So this idea that you are stopping students from getting an education by stopping campuses. Columbia, for example, Columbia University, where all of this started today, has now said that for the rest of the semester they will be operating remotely as a result of what's happened. So he did also focus on that as well. I should also note, perhaps, that in contrast, we did also get comments from the other presidential candidate today, Donald Trump, who praised the police response and condemned the students as radical left lunatics trying to take over the country. So a bit of a contrast there. Biden by himself, by contrast, also specifically criticized Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in his speech as well.
One thing he has done is said that the protest will have no effect on the United States position of Israel.
Yes, that was something that he didn't actually even include in his speech. It was simply a follow-up question after he finished. Mr. President, will this have any effect? Will this force you to change any policy? The simple answer from him, one word, no. And he did not address Gaza specifically in this speech either, saying anything about the Palestinian situation or anything along those lines, which of course is the reason for these protests.
So one thing that you do have to wonder is whether his words will actually make any difference to those protesters who are currently camping out and being displaced from goodness knows how many universities now. And it raises a bigger question if a younger generation is not listening to Joe Biden, who is coming out with a perfectly sort of cool-headed plea, how relevant is he as a president to them?
That is a very good question. It is absolutely the case that at the moment, at least, I don't get the impression that they will be listening to Joe Biden himself. They may be listening to the police response because it has gotten firmer and firmer. We've now had more than 2,000 students arrested at pro-Palestinian protests at more than 40 university campuses, and a huge amount of that was happening today, from UCLA to Portland to Dartmouth to Stony Brook in New York. So that has been a response. That said, even, for example, UCLA, as the protesters left, were kicked out of their encampments, they were in megaphones shouting, "We will be back."
Chris Cermak, thank you so much for joining us on the Monocle Daily. So let's dive into the discussions now. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and formerly CNN's Europe editor, and James Rodgers, associate professor of international journalism at City, University of London, and former BBC Moscow correspondent. A very good evening to you.
Good evening, Emma.
Lovely to have you in the studio. Before we even begin with the meat and drink, can you just talk through our pens? Because there's three journalists. I did need to ask you about your pen and the amount of paper that's been brought in. This is rare because a lot of our commentators come in and it's off the cuff. But this is some heavy homework has been done, and I've noticed you have a proper ink pen. Why?
I do, Emma. I think it's one of the few pleasures left in life in the 21st century, actually. I have a collection of ink pens, but I'm sure the listeners are not remotely interested in hearing about them, but I can talk about them at some length.
Okay, we can. Next time we have an ink story, we'll know who to ring. Nina, your pen. I picked my pen up in a taxi. Where did you get yours from?
It was the last one I had left that my two sons hadn't nicked. I did start out several years ago with expensive pens, and nice flashy pens you had in the bottom of your handbag from some hotel in Rio de Janeiro or something like that. But, my boys find those the best to play with.
And as three journalists around the table, how many times have we gone out to a job and not had a pen?
Never.
Always.
Never
actually. I've always really got, I've normally got at least 3 or 4 with me.
I've had to borrow pens off camera crews forever. They're carrying thousands of pounds worth of equipment, and I needed a pen, and that's all it was. Thank you for that. Let us have a quick look. James, let me just ask you now about the fact that we've had Chris Cermak in the studio talking about the protests across the United States, and Joe Biden now stepping in as a university lecturer in the teeth of academia. Is there a lot of protest and sentiment in the corridors of City at the minute?
There's certainly an awful lot of sentiment. I mean, the university where I teach has actually got examinations at the moment, so there's not a lot of students around apart from coming in to take those. I do teach modules on international news. I teach a module on the reporting of armed conflict as part of the journalism courses that I teach at the university. As you can imagine, since October, which is almost the entirety of the academic year, it has been a subject that has aroused a great deal of controversy, a great deal of interest and a great deal of discussion, simply for the fact that this is, as it's often been described, this conflict and the attacks of October the 7th, the biggest single day of violence against Israel in the history of the entire state, and Israel's response, of course, has dwarfed anything that's happened in the Palestinian territories since the 1967 war. So we really are living in times that, even people of my age, and I'm in my 50s, can barely remember, but this particular generation have got no experience of. And yet, this is a conflict which has, as we've seen from what's happening in the United States and elsewhere, it is a conflict that resonates right around the world, even if it's about this relatively tiny piece of land.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's turn now to Ukraine, where journalists are to be allowed back into the country's parliament. The access will be limited, but it will be the first time since Russia's invasion more than 2 years ago. Since the war broke out, live streaming was forbidden under martial law. Security risks have stopped journalists from entering the chamber. Nina, let's begin with you as an international correspondent. What is this a sign of in terms of what Ukraine is trying to do here? Is it a sign of a more confident country that is able to feel it can be more open given the situation? Or is this a country that wants to be seen and to be heard?
Well, remember that this is coming at an important time because it's World Press Freedom Day tomorrow, actually. And Ukraine has been coming up the ranks of, World Press Freedom indexes, in particular the one that's compiled by Reporters Without Borders. That's the one that's coming out tomorrow. It came up last year to 79 out of 180 countries that they surveyed. Previously, it was at 106 out of 180. And obviously the constraints of martial law when you've got a country that can't have elections and that is, essentially a war zone at a time of hybrid warfare, by the way, where disinformation campaigns are obviously an expertise that Russia has honed over the years in Ukraine and elsewhere. That's something that Zelensky's government is clearly rather sensitive about. And for that reason, they have had some restrictions on reporters being able to report inside the parliament for, much of the war up until now. But I think the focus is there have been a few blunders recently by the security services, haven't there, raiding or potentially looking like they've compromised certain investigative journalism outlets when they've, tried to, mount investigations into the activities of the intelligence services in Ukraine. And those have been viewed as, rather badly. So I think this is perhaps, trying to at least give political journalists the opportunity to report upon a parliament as though it's functioning to a certain extent in a normal way.
And James, will journalists see this as enough? Or, as we all know, when someone opens a door a tiny bit as a journalist, you keep on pushing that door open. Yeah,
I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, even, the most long-standing democracies have got different rules on the media in times of war. There are justifiable security concerns. I mean, just thinking of a few examples from history, the BBC, it was, very, very much in the service of the government during the Second World War. The only time in the last century where this country faced invasion. One phrase that one historian used was that the BBC staff felt they were always on the front line. They very much felt they were part of it. Not the way that journalists traditionally see themselves, of course. Ukraine is in a difficult situation. It has got these legitimate security concerns, but it's also fighting an enemy which is exactly the opposite of how it wants to define itself in the 21st century. It does not want to become this autocratic, quasi-totalitarian government that Russia is. And an important part of that, if you look at the way that Russia's responded to the war, for example, making independent journalism in effect absolutely impossible and theoretically punishable by law, then Ukraine wants to do something different, but it also wants to uphold press freedom, but it also needs got national security concerns. I have to say, when I first went to Ukraine in 1991, I got a press pass for the Ukrainian Parliament just from one day to the next. So I think it was very much open, and I think they're still building. They've tried to continue to build that openness during their post-Soviet history, but it's not very easy at the moment.
They've had up to 4,000 people register to go into the 4,000 journalists go into the Parliament. And James mentioned there the issue of security. It makes the Parliament is the only legislative body which is still operating during martial law. So it is clearly something that needs to exist. But the minute that you allow people, members of the public, back in, there is going to be that inevitable fear of risk, isn't there?
It's operated without elections, though. And this is the crucial thing, because I was talking about those two sort of blunders by the Ukrainian security services, the SBU, a few months ago. A lot of that happened in the autumn when there was a lot of talk that President Zelensky might feel that he was in a position to, call elections. Previously, he's hinted that he wouldn't stand again. That might change now. That's obviously off the cards now. So I think this is probably why we're now seeing, if we're not going to have elections, well, at least there needs to be a little bit more transparency in terms of the functioning of the Parliament. But I would make one observation, just to pick up on what James was saying before. When I went to Ukraine to meet a few of the media owners before the war, it was quite an interesting, wouldn't you agree, James? It was quite an interesting ecosystem anyway, because you had oligarchs who had their own political positions, who are often, in some cases, not just media owners, but members of parliament as well, with their own agendas. And so it wasn't the same type of ecosystem that we now see here, with sort of rather thrusting independent journalism outlets that are mostly all online. And as I was saying before, it's going up the Press Freedom Index, that at least, let's see what the number is tomorrow.
It is a country in need of democratic openness. I mean, before the invasion by Russia, Volodymyr Zelensky was pushing for a major anti-corruption drive when he came into power. This is one of the tickets that got him elected. And I wonder whether opening up the Parliament will be a sign to the outside world that those who continue to back Ukraine will find a trustworthy partner who know where their money and their arms are going.
That may be an element, of course, yes. But it is true to say that, Nina's talking about press freedom indices. If you look at the corruption indices from, any time from 1991 onwards, Ukraine did not score highly on those. We've seen officials dismissed even during the war, particularly in relation to defence procurement. So this is not something that the countries, I think, a lot of countries, and Ukraine is no exception in this, during a time of war, they have to set aside reform things. You can't, do things when you're facing what is still, after 2 years and longer, if you go back to 2014, an existential threat.
Let's move on to a story which is sort of slightly chimes rather uncomfortably with what we've just been talking about, democracy and freedom of speech and press freedom, because I don't know about you, but take a walk around London today and you'd be forgiven for not realising that the UK's capital and the rest of England is experiencing one of its key moments in its democratic cycle, the mayoral elections. But what is different this time around is that voters have to take photo identification with them. And this is causing problems. Who here has voted? I'd say hands up, but that doesn't make much sense in the radio.
Yeah, I voted.
And did you take your...
I did. I took my driving licence.
Okay.
And it was all very straightforward, I have to say.
I'm going after this, and I've got my driver's licence in my bag.
And I shall exercise my democratic right a little bit later too. Is it a problem that we have to take voter ID?
I think in principle, yes, it is actually. I do think that. If you look at, I can see the reason for it, that the previous system that we had in this country was open to abuse, but actually seems not to have been abused. So I think it's, I was just looking at this in preparation for our discussion today. There are 46.5 million registered voters in this country, and between 2019 and 2023, OK, I don't know if that includes it must include the general election in late 2019, there were 1,462 reported cases of electoral fraud and 10 criminal convictions. So it's not, in other words, a major problem in this country.
So we're solving a problem that doesn't exist?
Well, I don't know. It seems, we have never had identity cards in this country. The Labour government about 20 years ago tried to introduce them. I think the only time we've ever had them in history was during the Second World War. We've been talking about extra precautions in time of war. It's not something for which there's a great deal of public appetite, which is why it's difficult to know what to take, because we don't have ID cards. I actually went to the gym this morning, but I didn't want to take stuff with me, and the polling station's right next to the gyms, but I went home because I didn't want to leave stuff lying around, any valuable thing like my driving licence, my passport.
Well done,
I had
London.
to go home and then make a separate trip back. Not in my gym kit. Sorry for my fellow electors, but I don't think it's a major problem, Emma. I can see. So in principle, maybe it is, but it doesn't look as if the evidence is really there to back up this change in policy.
What it does seem to have done, though, is create a separate secondary problem, which is the number of people who are so-called at risk, ethnic minority, younger voters who don't actually either possess or want to take part in an election that requires photo ID.
That's the crucial bit, isn't it? So I think there's a generational divide here. I'm on the side where, having lived in many European countries where you have to carry ID at all times, actually. It's an obligation in some countries, and that's completely culturally normal. I don't think it's a problem having an ID, but I do recognise that older people will find this quite confusing. Younger people, as you were saying before, might be disincentivised from voting. And that's the real concern here. The question is whether or not we know for younger people, and as you were saying before, minorities who might not have the right ID, they might just avoid it altogether. That's the concern.
And there's an educational aspect as well. Trying to get people to vote in this day and age is, I suspect, going to be quite a heavy ask for Brits. But also, I think I read somewhere that up to 20% of voters, that's almost 1 in 5 voters, don't actually know about the new rules. So there's clearly a communication problem here.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious when you go to a polling station, though. That's actually before I got to get my ballot paper. Somebody came up, one of the officials came up and asked if I'd got my photo ID. So at which point, it was probably going to be explained to me that I needed to go and get something and come back again. So I think it's pretty clear. There's been quite a lot of stuff in the media and you can find it. But I found it quite difficult to look last night what I needed to take, because I didn't want to take anything that was too valuable, in other words. But so I just, it's not entirely clear, but it's very clear when you get there.
But this is a real problem in places like the United States. This is where this is a real wedge issue, because remember that in the US, people have to travel around and move about the US quite a lot to keep a job. very often they need a job for their healthcare and so on and so forth. And they can't always avail themselves of the right documentation or have been living in the right part of one particular state to vote when elections happen. So I wonder whether or not we're importing more of an American wedge issue with this need for voter ID issues, because as you were just saying before, James, the numbers don't really show that there's a big enough problem here. It's not the same dynamic as in America.
Yeah, I mean, 10 criminal convictions out of an electorate of 46.5 million does not suggest this was a widespread problem that needed solving.
Let's carry on with the issue of immigration, something which politicians like to play about with an awful lot. And one wonders when the word immigration became such a dirty word. As populism spreads and as the Brexit vote here in the United Kingdom 8 years ago demonstrates, it has become rather easy to make people fearful of foreigners. Because the international economics body, the OECD, has said something rather different today. It has said that high flows of immigration make markets stronger, boost growth and makes a country more productive. Now, this is a surprise, isn't it? Because I wonder what sort of immigration we're talking about here. Nina?
Well, so, look, this is something that we were talking earlier on about the Tony Blair days when, for instance, he was talking about bringing in ID cards back then. That was a classic time when we saw the economy be boosted by high levels of immigration, wasn't it? The idea was that if we can get all these young workers here, they'll be able to earn more, they'll be buying into the housing market, that'll support people. The question mark in my mind is it depends how you manage your economy, because you then have to invest to make sure that you can upskill the next generation of those immigrants' children so that they can then give back in terms of taxes, and that the tax take actually matches the resources that they will need from the country. And I think this is where, for instance, in places like the UK, there's real concern about immigration, because the economic mismanagement has meant there's a mismatch here. In fact, if you look at the statistics that came out just this week on legal migration, the UK is facing huge deficits in people from care sector workers, health sector workers, because obviously they've curtailed they've made more stringent the requirements and said that you can't bring in family members for this very reason. So I think, yes, on the one hand, there's a big concern over whether or not immigration is a cheap economic quick trick. But when it gets to the second and third generation, you have to then invest in education and, upskilling those workers so that then they can obviously, earn enough and pay back in tax.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult for any government here because, you're very right to highlight the Brexit referendum, Emma, I think, because it just means that, before that, I mean, when you looked at what people were concerned about in elections in, as Nina's just been talking about, the early years of this century, it was almost invariably their personal economy and healthcare. Immigration, relations with the European Union just never, ever came up in voter surveys. And, of course, during the Brexit referendum and the very ill-tempered debate that followed that, and mostly followed it in this country, of course, because nobody Leave or Remain actually thought that Leave would win the referendum, or very few did anyway. So the debate was, in a sense, had afterwards. So it's very, very difficult, even when you have the pure economic, financial case like this. The political case in this country is currently much, much harder to make. Remember the démarche that the European Commission made a couple of weeks ago about remaking Erasmus much more open to British students again, and free movement for the under-30s. That was absolutely quashed. I mean, actually, I personally was slightly surprised by the timing of that. If I'd been the European Commission and didn't want it to be accepted, I would have raised it in a few months before before a British general election. It seemed, very odd timing to me, because it's not the sort of thing that's going to fly, and neither of the main parties is going to sign up to that ahead of an election we expect this year. So it's difficult. There's a tension here between the economic case made by the OECD and other research organisations and the state of politics in this country, I think.
I was trying to work out if there is any country I have been to which actively welcomes immigration. There has been a path since, for as long as I can remember now, of we must cut down on immigration. And even when you see somewhere like Germany, which is struggling, then you see Italy, which has gone to the far right. When you look at France and Macron, having his chain pulled by the far right and it becoming an ethnic and diversity issue. I mean, can anyone think of a place where they have said, yeah, come here and we will make our country richer and more in every single way?
Well, I guess the big exception is Germany's acceptance of people from Syria around 2015. But that was used by the Leave campaign in this country, totally wrong-headedly, of course, but it was effective as a reason against immigration and as a reason to leave the European Union. So no, I don't think I can. I mean, one thinks of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it seems like a big counterexample in a completely different time.
But I think that there's a huge amount of hypocrisy, isn't there, in the debate on immigration? Because being a born and bred Londoner, London had no problem with accepting very wealthy individuals to come and invest in our housing market, to come and pay private school fees if they came from countries like Ukraine, Russia, wherever it is in the world, as long as, they had deep pockets. There's other places like Australia, for instance, that have tried to coax British healthcare workers and doctors over to Australia on the promise of higher salaries if they're young, they have young families. So I think it can be a bit more nuanced. There's obviously, benefits to immigration. If you're in a Sardinian village where the average age is 80, of which there are many of those villages, they're desperate for people to come from the United States, from the UK, anywhere if they can, invest in the community and they're young.
And briefly, there is the fact that immigration will never stop, for the simple reason that if you walk down the streets, in London at least, the Polish voices, the German voices, the French voices, the Italian voices in the cafes and in the wards of our hospitals may have gone, but they have now been replaced by Indian, Bangladeshi and Pakistani ones.
Yeah, I mean, it comes and goes though, doesn't it? I mean, isn't London in Roman times supposed to have been one of the most diverse city on earth at that time, and then subsequently became less so, and now, of course, is again. It's, you're right. I mean, hearing the different languages you can hear just by taking public transport here or any public place, it's true.
Let's continue with our final item on the discussion, at least, to talk about a continuing issue of labour shortages and skills. Hay fever season is just about to get going in Japan, and if you are susceptible, then be warned. The cedar tree is a particularly troublesome culprit, and efforts by the authorities to cut down these offending things are being hampered by the fact that there aren't enough people in the logging industry to go around and do the job. What a Japanese problem. I've never heard of it. I did a little bit of reading into this one, and apparently pruning and harvesting cedar trees is something that started in the 14th century. So this is something that the Japanese are very good at, but there's not enough people.
Is it not quite hard work? I mean, pruning, fine, but actually chopping them down. One imagines that you
sounded so work-tired, James.
I'm not so work-tired, but I mean, as I've already revealed, I'm in my 50s, and much as I wouldn't mind having a go at being a lumberjack. I've done quite a lot of different jobs. Not that I suspect my peak lumberjack career age has passed.
Well, we see you
sharing a shirt.
I don't know.
A Monty Python moment.
That's such an outdated view. I'm sure that lumberjacks don't want to have check shirts these
James,
days.
I feel so touched that we have a problem that's happening in Japan, and you're actually considering your own personal suitability for the job.
Well, why not? You like to help out. I've always had a very international outlook. If I thought, I've just started a sabbatical at the university where I teach. I'm supposed to be writing a book and preparing a research grant application, but I'm sure if I had a word with the university and said I'm going to take my career off in a different way, but I don't think I'm probably what they're looking for, unfortunately.
There is an official Japanese forestry logging organisation, so if you are listening, James might be available for a little bit of...
I bet their website's not in English, unfortunately, is it?
Google Translate. I can see it. You're like someone who doesn't want to do their homework. Any excuse.
Coax over a few Canadian lumberjacks.
So we're not going to see you up a tree anytime soon or chopping one down.
Well, I'm 5'1.5", so I wouldn't get very far, if I'm honest. But I do love cedar trees. I wouldn't want to chop one down.
No, don't go to... Well, maybe go to Japan. There's plenty going around. The question that it sort of raises, though, is that I love the fact that if you are in Japan and you have hay fever, then the government will go as far as to chop trees down for you. I find that an incredibly sort of a noble thing to do. So the question is begged, if there is something that you would like the government to do to make your daily life have less of a sort of a grain of sand in the oyster, what might it be? I mean, I was thinking that I'd quite like to have banned people who have their phones about a foot away from them and either watch television or shout into them in the street. I'm not entirely sure what you'd have to chop down first.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'm afraid I think that battle's been lost, certainly. Talking about public transport in London, as we were a little earlier. Mine is stopping on motorists stopping on pedestrian crossings. I'd make that quite severely punished, like banned from using your car for a week.
Not stopping, you mean?
People, when they do stop on it, I think you should lose the right to drive for a week.
Isn't there a quiet pleasure in mouthing an obscenity at the person, silently mouthing an obscenity at the person as they attempt to run over your foot? I quite like thinking of, how creative I can be with my hands.
That's because you've lived in France. Just give them a good Gallic shrug.
Anything you might ban?
God, the list would be so long. I don't know. I mean, lying for a start.
Lying.
As a journalist with
definitely lost that battle,
World Press Freedom Day tomorrow.
Definitely lost that battle,
They're
I
going
think.
to try and do that in Wales, aren't they? They want to try and make lying in Parliament a criminal offence.
Yeah.
I think I heard that a couple of days ago.
Yes, that's true. Right.
So you're going to be Ukrainian. You can go to live in Wales.
I can't speak Welsh. I wouldn't know whether they're lying or not.
So the police will do it.
But hey, no cedar trees there, I think.
No cedar trees. And we'll let you know, James, if anybody from Japan rings and says we need you, because this is an ageing population and they're recruiting even over the over 50s.
Are
so
they?
don't worry.
Who knows?
There's time. There's time.
You could cancel your gym membership. Get all the exercise in you need.
Absolutely. Finally, on today's Daily, our weekly series of letters from around the world comes from Seattle. Monocle's Greg Scruggs goes hunting along the Pacific Northwest beaches for dueling state clams.
When I moved to the Pacific Northwest several years ago, I was well aware of my new home's nickname, the Evergreen State. So it came as little surprise to learn that Washington had an official state tree, the Western Hemlock. And along the way, I've discovered several other proud specimens of the local flora and fauna that have earned a legislative imprimatur as official state symbols. There is an official state fruit, the apple, vegetable, the Walla Walla sweet onion, fish, the steelhead trout, and there are both official endemic and marine mammals. Those would be the Olympic marmot and orca whale, respectively. There is even already an official state bivalve, the Austria Lorida oyster, designated in 2014. So as I tracked draft legislation at the State House this year, I took notice of House Bill 1984, entitled An Act Relating to Designating the Pacific Razor Clam as the State Clam. The bill notes that heading to one of Washington's Pacific Coast beaches to dig for the endemic creature is a local rite of passage during the clamming season, roughly November to May. What's more, razor clamming is a fairly democratic sport. All you need are a pair of muck boots, a kind of souped-up Wellington boot made from neoprene, and a clam gun, which, contrary to the name, and likely to the disappointment of most American Second Amendment activists, does not mean that one catches a razor clam by shooting it. Rather, a clam gun is a T-shaped tube and handle contraption made from aluminum or PVC plastic. The intrepid clammer scours the beach at low tide for slight depressions or bubbles that might indicate a clam burrowed beneath the surface. The clammer then inserts the tube into the sand, twists several times to generate suction, then removes the tube where a column of sand is lodged inside. Empty the tube's contents onto the beach, then poke around with a shovel to see if you've struck pay dirt. Repeat ad nauseum or until you go numb with cold. The North Pacific averaging a nippy 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, with the air temperature during clamming season ranging from just above freezing to a balmy 8. Not exactly sun lounger weather. Last season, some 300,000 people dug up a combined 5.1 million clams. My family barely contributed to that total. Our first attempt at razor clamming last year was a dismal failure. We did not limit out, as the local parlance goes, and catch our allotted 15 clams per person before we gave up and retreated to our hotel. Perhaps it was just a fair weather clammer's bad luck. It was an absolutely glorious sunny and warm spring day. Seasoned razor clammers insist you have to go out in the depths of winter, preferably when the low tide falls in the dark, and the wind is blowing the frigid rain sideways while you are digging a sandpit up to your shoulder, convinced the clam is just a little bit deeper. Author David Berger describes this experience as reaching in to turn around a breached calf, one of many evocative metaphors in his 2017 ode to the shellfish, Razor Clams, Buried Treasure of the Pacific Northwest, in which the Seattle art critic turned obsessive clammer celebrates the broad cross-section of the populace who seem to find joy in this kind of suffering. All of which to say, there is plenty to bolster the case that the Pacific razor clam, Latin name Siliqua patella, deserves serious consideration. As the bill concluded, the legislature therefore finds that the Pacific razor clam is an icon of the state, worthy of the title of official clam of the state of Washington. Additionally, unlike other Northwest clam species, razor clams are very mobile, with a powerful foot, providing a sporting chase! ! But the powerful gooey duck lobby begged to differ. For the uninitiated, the gooey duck is a squirting clam, whose appearance can only be described as aggressively phallic. The butt, or if you will, the genitalia of many a joke, the gooey duck is also a prized delicacy overseas, where it fetches up to $150 per pound in Asian seafood markets.
Whoa, that's a big one.
That's $150.
Yeah.
Local shellfish company CEOs spoke up in favor of the mighty gooey duck, the world's largest and deepest burrowing clam, noting that particularly well-endowed specimens can weigh as much as 7 pounds and dig several feet under the surface. Perhaps influencing state legislators to give this rival due consideration was the fact that the gooey duck is the mascot of the Evergreen State College, located just down the road from the state capitol in Olympia. The experimental school, founded at the height of 60s hippie culture, has a famously laissez-faire motto, Omnia Extates, or let it all hang out, that seems to jive with the gooey duck's cheeky, or perhaps more accurately, cocky appearance. Should the Evergreen State give due official clam honors to a valuable export commodity or the object of a broadly popular recreational pursuit? In the end, the dueling clams generated a political impasse, and House Bill 1984 did not make it out of committee. As the bill's author, Representative Brian Blake, said, cue the groan, sometimes you just have to stick your neck out. Better luck next year, Brian, and happy clamming. For Monocle in Seattle, I'm Gregory Scruggs.
Thank you, Greg. And that's all we have time for today's edition of the Monocle Daily. The warmest of thanks to my panellists, Nina dos Santos and James Rodgers, and to the producer, Chris Chermak, and researcher, George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Emma Nelson here in London. The Monocle Daily's back at the same time tomorrow. So goodbye, and thank you very much for listening.